Tales of Xillia was always one of the lesser Tales games in my mind. I was a big Tales fan, loved Symphonia, Vesperia, Graces, even Symphonia 2, so I sat down to play Xillia on release day and was underwhelmed. I missed having a traditional overworld, the environments were boring, the characters didn't do much for me, there wasn't an interesting equipment system, and combat felt too simple. I picked Mila since her playstyle seemed more interesting based on the pre-release information we had, and looking back, that was a mistake. I missed out on some key story moments that you get with Jude, which was another factor in why I wasn't so high on the game. Overall, I liked Xillia okay. It's still a Tales game, and I like Tales, but it always stuck out as one of my least favorites in the series. But I'm not here to talk about my first playthrough. I recently replayed Xillia as Jude this time, and on New Game Plus, and I had a blast. I respect this game much more than I used to, and I'ma tell you why. In the first half or so of the game though, I was getting flashbacks to my initial experience with Tales of Xillia. It is so slow for about the first 2/3 of the story, most of the first 2 acts. Story scenes drag out, and characters' reactions to what happens in them, the general speed of the dialogue, action, everything is just so slow. Tales has had a problem with this ever since Symphonia, and it never stopped throughout the game, but since the story takes 20 hours to really get going, I felt this in Xillia more than ever. It doesn't help that the story gets sidetracked early on when Mila hurts her legs and has to wait until they're healed. This happens too early, before enough interesting plot points have occurred, and it makes the game lose steam before it ever has a chance to pick up. I don't think it adds much to Mila's character anyway. She was determined and unstoppable before, and stayed that way after being healed. There was no character development, and removing this lull would have improved the game. On the other hand, this section isn't that long, and by the end of the game, I forgot it had even happened until a character mentioned it. Other story beats feel rote and forced. When Elise is added to the party, for example, she's initially being protected by Jude and his companions and doesn't get to battle. Soon enough though, there's a simple cutscene where she steps in against a tough boss, uses a healing spell, everyone says thank you, and now she gets to fight alongside the party. This was obviously done just to make Elise available as a full team member and wasn't fleshed out enough to feel like an organic part of the story. The party had been protecting her, and it was strange how quickly they changed their mind to allow her to fight, with zero pushback, all in one short scene. I would have liked a little more dialogue between them, discussing Elise's abilities and what she could contribute. Again, this isn't a major problem with the game, but little flaws like this add up. There's other events during the story that are more important to moving the game forward and introducing characters, but are just plain boring. Meeting with Drizel Sherrilton, for example, is excruciatingly long and drawn out for no reason other than to make sure you remember she exists. It's not only story problems that had me reaffirming my sour opinion of the game. Environments are samey to the point that it seems like laziness on the part of the developers, although I understand Xillia was rushed and I don't want to blame the hardworking artists and designers. But man, I was running through what felt like the same areas over and over again, just with slightly different colors. Thankfully, you can get through each new area quickly, especially on New Game Plus, since you don't have to fight many battles to stay appropriately leveled. This doesn't excuse how every Sea Haven is copy and pasted with the same layout, just why? Also, there's this weird haze around the screen in certain areas, but not in others, for no apparent reason, and okay, I'll move on. Visuals aren't the most important thing anyway, and Xillia looks pretty good overall. It's nice how you can fast travel from anywhere, even inside buildings. This was a big improvement from previous games that I remember loving in my first playthrough as well. Every Tales game, hell, every RPG needs this feature. And I especially love how, if you can't go somewhere for story reasons, the game doesn't stop you from fast traveling entirely, it just takes those locations off the list. That's perfect. Also, combat clicked with me this time around. Maybe it's because I played on New Game Plus, but I had a blast learning all the link arts and experimenting with different characters. Battles rarely felt like a chore, since I could always try a new strategy if I got bored. The Lilium Orb was tedious and slow to navigate, but I like the system overall, just not how long it takes to actually use. One last point about the early game is that Alvin's betrayal is too obvious and on the nose. The developers have said they wanted it to be obvious so you'd wonder why he betrayed you, but this didn't work for me. Maybe I don't have enough faith in the Tales team's storytelling to give them the benefit of the doubt, so for most of the game I thought it was bad writing. Instead of wondering why he kept betraying the party, I wondered why the game made it so obvious. His character would have worked either way, so there was no reason for this. By the end though, I appreciated how Alvin's story turned out, but that doesn't make the writing for the early game any better. I still think that the writers could have handled Alvin in a more subtle way. On the plus side, he's a fun character and I always enjoyed having him in my party even though I didn't use him in battle much. Now, I've been pretty negative so far, but I want this retrospective to reflect my experience replaying Xillia, and for the first 20 hours or so, about the first 2/3 of the story, I was remembering why I wasn't so hot on this game. The only part I thoroughly enjoyed up to that point this time around was the combat, but that changed pretty quickly. The second half of Tales of Xillia is freaking great. That includes about the last third of the story and all the endgame and postgame content. For one, you start getting a lot more side content. I love side content. After each major story beat, if you revisit practically any location in the game, you'll find new NPC dialogue, quests, and little moments that continue previous events. Side quests are all mostly short, they often bring you to new areas of the game, and you get useful rewards like gold or hefty shop upgrade items, or fun stuff like costume accessories. I appreciate costumes more than I used to, so I rarely felt like these quests were a waste of time. The shop system is a ton of fun too, and makes exploration always worth doing since you'll get more odds and ends for upgrading shop levels. Watching these bars fill up never gets old, and while it's not as addictive as something like leveling weapons in Berseria, it's a solid mechanic. Despite the slow story and awkward cutscenes, I enjoyed getting to know all the characters, and Xillia has hilarious skits, possibly the best in the series overall. They're quick, to the point, and frequently funny, filled with the kind of innuendo I love in JRPGs. The humor in this game is on point. Rowan in particular has heaps of stereotypical old man lines that never fail to make me laugh, and Teepo's obsession with bazongas, which really indicates Elise's own insecurities, was fantastic. You know, despite finding Teepo annoying in the early game, I ended up really enjoying her, him, it? I guess it is appropriate since in a nice scene at the end, Elise puts it away so she can start using her own voice. Moments like this were touching and show how well Xillia managed to develop its characters overall, with the mid-game revelation that Teepo is an extension of Elise's personality changing my whole perspective on that little ragdoll. I had forgotten all about this since my first playthrough. While the narrative isn't exactly coherent, I was interested the whole time, which is an improvement over an entry like Vesperia. I say it wasn't coherent because there's no existential threat this time around, and I found myself agreeing with Gaius, the main villain, on everything he did. He certainly wasn't evil, and while the game reconciles this by making him your friend at the very end, this makes the story overall less impactful than most Tales games. Xillia struggles to create stakes that matter because the world would have turned out okay whether or not Gaius got his way. His solution made sense, and I was actually rooting for him for most of the game, which I don't think was the writer's intent. On the other hand, Jude and Mila's goals were idealistic and relied on luck to work out the way they did. For example, without spy rights as a convenient late-game solution, the world would have been drained of mana after a few years had Spyrexes continued to be used by Olympius. I don't mind this though because the world building was interesting, the characters were likable, and I always wanted to see what happened next. Feeling compelled to keep going is key for me in JRPGs, and after the introduction of Olympius at the end of Act 2, I was hooked. Mila is the most interesting character in the game. Her philosophical questions of what's best for the world from her godlike perspective provided something different than the usual human perspective we get in JRPGs, as represented here by Jude, and watching her on her journey was usually fantastic. Jude, on the other hand, is a bit boring. He's the follower, always going along with Mila's path, and we rarely get an idea of what he believes. That's weak writing, but the rest of the cast made up for it. I especially appreciate that the game doesn't take the familiar route of collect the 4 spirits, then beat the big bad that's so common in other Tales games and other RPGs. Instead, Mila gets them all back at once, just in time for the finale. That was cool, and the eventful back half of the game made up for this slow beginning. There's other odd bits of charm that impressed me. One time, while walking through a field, Leia said, "Guys, Rowan's not looking so good. Shouldn't we stop and get him healed up?" That's a nice way to let me know one of my party members was low on HP, and it makes battles feel connected with the rest of the game. It's an example of how far JRPGs have come, and I'm excited to watch the genre continue to evolve. Alright, I could go on, but that's enough for this video. It's time to give Xillia 2 a shot next. Thanks for watching, hit that like button for the algorithm, subscribe for more videos on JRPGs, and have a blessed day.